Okay, so here we go with the beginning of the second half, and we're going to start off with Monopolies. Now, I know majority of you guys have played the game Monopoly, and as you probably know, the point of the game is to own everything, all the property, the houses, the railways, things like that. That is basically what a monopoly is. A corporation or a company that owns and controls the entire market of something. Now, in the game Monopoly, you're supposed to get real estate, the houses, the railways, the utilities, things like that. So no matter where anybody falls, they owe you money. Okay, that's what a monopoly is. Now, people who don't like monopolies, they basically say their argument is that those type of people can raise the price of products to whatever they want. So think of it like this: if let's say you particularly own all the gasoline production companies there is in the world, who's going to tell you, yeah, you can't put the price that high? Who's going to tell you anything? You own it all. Yeah, you'll have angry people, but if they want gasoline, they're going to have to come to you. So that's that part. Okay. Now, there's people who kind of supported monopolies. They believe that the corporations would keep the prices low because if they raised it too high, then some other competitor might come up, and then people would flock to them in a sense. You know, um, another thing that might be is that, let's say, going again with the gas example, if you own all the gas making companies, and somehow, some way, somebody finds out of the blue an alternative for gas, people are not going to pay for gas all of a sudden now because hey, now there's something else, something that we can use instead of gas, which would more likely be cheaper if you raise the price, you know, up here. So that's what some people who supported monopolies said. Now, to own a monopoly, technically it was not illegal, but some states were like, you know what, we don't want monopolies here because they were opponents of it. They didn't want a company to come in to own who owned everything, because then if they came into their state, they could set that price way up here, and it's going to hurt people and their state. So what ended up happening is a lot of corporations they found a way around that title of monopolies, um, and around the law of it being quote unquote illegal. And these were something called a trust. Now, a trust is a legal concept where one person manages another person's property. Okay, um, and that person's called a trustee. Now, that person who manages the other person's property, basically they oversee all the stuff. Okay, technically they are the owners, they do control it, but under let's say the company's charter, the way the foundation is of it, um, they are not technically the owners, um, but they do run it, you know. So that's one way around it. So they say, we don't own all the companies, the trust does, you know. So if you look on the picture to your right, you'll see that it's a great political cartoon. It says Steel Beam Trust, Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, Iron Trust. And if you look at the banner above their heads, the big guys, it says this is a Senate of the monopolist, by the monopolist, and for the monopolist. Now, if you look at those senator guys at the bottom, some of them are looking back at the trust people to basically say, hey, what do we do? Vote yes, vote no. What do you want, in a sense? Because the thing is, that's how it was. They were basically bought off. You know, remember we talked about bribery in the last video? They were basically bought off, and they went to the big wigs, guys. what do we do? And if you look at the back of that picture, you can see a thing that says people's entrance, and there's a lock and it says closed. Because we, the people, cannot afford to pay off a senator, a congressman, things like that. But big corporations, they can, and they could back then, especially back then. So they were the ones who ran the country, not really the politicians. The politicians were bought and paid for. Um, so the first company that was so big that incorporated a trust was Standard Oil, and that happened in 1882. Now, the other thing that trusts do is they have these other things called holding companies. Now, holding companies, they are not the companies that actually make things. Um, they basically own the stock of the companies that produces the stuff, and they effectively merge them into one giant company. So you got one side that uh, makes the stuff, whatever it may be, and the other side that owns the stock of the stuff. Okay, and then they merge them together to form one company. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. If not, um, bring your questions to class. Okay. Now, there were two major monopolies in the Second Industrial Revolution. Um, they were headed by two larger than life men. One of them was Carnegie. He owned the Carnegie Steel Company, which is now known as U.S. Steel. And the other was Standard Oil Company, which was owned by John D. Rockefeller. Now, Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, if depends on your translation of his last name, is the guy on the top. Uh, he's a very, very fascinating man, in my opinion. I would strongly recommend that you guys watch The Men Who Built America. It's a great series, and they talk about these two guys for a majority of it, and you'd be surprised um, the crap that Carnegie went through, and also John D. Rockefeller, who owned Standard Oil. He was a ruthless businessman. And again, through that series, you can see how he came to be truly one of the richest men in this country. And if I remember right, he is still considered in the like top three richest men ever. Um, but the thing is, these two guys were natural competitors. And again, I said it already, but you got to watch that show because they do a really, really good job at showing how they clashed time and time again. It's a really, really good show. Uh, I would strongly recommend that you watch it. And like I said, these two guys, Carnegie and Rockefeller, become two of the richest men all time in U.S. history. Now we're going to start with Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, however you want to pronounce it. Um, he was a Scottish immigrant. Now he worked for a railway executive guy named Thomas Scott. Now Scott basically saw potential in Carnegie, and he was like, you know what, this kid is actually pretty smart and he's driven. So he gave him more responsibility, and as time went on, Carnegie learned from Scott, and Scott took him under his wing as his right-hand man. Now, Scott had this envision of building a bridge going to St. Louis across the Mississippi. But here's the problem. The area where he wanted to make the bridge it was a long distance for the bridge. A lot of bridges that went through the Mississippi were very short because the Mississippi was a very strong river, and if it was too long, it might collapse. And basically, Carnegie uh, realized that in order to to make a strong bridge, they needed a material called steel. So his company, the Keystone Bridge Company, they ended up building that bridge using steel. But the thing is to find and how to manufacture the steel, that was the key. Because the way they made steel back then, it took a long time to melt it down, to make it in that amount of quantities. As you can see from the picture to your right, that's a lot of steel. And to get that much, to form it into those rods and beams and bolts and things like that, took time. But Carnegie went around and he talked to different people. He talked to basically chemists. How is steel made? What's the quickest way? He went to factories. What's the way to make a large amount of it? And then he found out a way to make the shape of it quicker, from a couple weeks to 15 minutes. That's a big difference. Now he starts making the bridge, and the thing is, he calls on investors to help him out to make the bridge, and they give him the money, and he makes it. And what ends up happening is, once people realize, wow, this steel stuff is amazing, he gets a bunch of orders to start making steel beams. Um, the railroad companies are going to change out their old tracks and convert them to beams, because beams of steel lasted longer. They were stronger as opposed to their iron beams that they had before, and other type of metals that would bend and expand and some of that during hot weather. You know, uh, so who better than his railroad friend Scott to help him out? And Scott helped him build his first steel plant. And from that point on, basically, it's smooth sailing for Carnegie. He has some bumps along the roads. He has some controversies, which, again, if you watch the Men Who Built America, uh, they explain that a little bit better. But when it comes from money, oh, that's it. He's smooth sailing from there on. Um, and this launches him into instant success.